The wind howled through the Wyoming woods, rattling the old window panes of the cabin we'd rented for a long overdue getaway. Autumn here had a bite to it, the crisp air carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. I stood by the fire, scratching Mutt's ears. He was a scrappy-looking dog, a mix of who knows what, with wiry fur and a nose that seemed to twitch at every sound. I'd picked him up at a shelter back in Detroit, where I worked fixing IT systems and dreaming about the open road. Mutt had been my constant companion since riding shotgun in my old Mustang whenever I needed to clear my head. The cabin was a simple place. One large room with a couple of bunks, a wood stove, and a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. My friends and I, Alex, who had a knack for getting into trouble, Melanie, who claimed she'd never been scared in her life, and Pete, always the skeptic, were here to relax, hike, and drink in the beauty of the season. Wyoming in the fall had a rugged charm, with its towering pines and aspens blazing gold against a slate-gray sky. That first night, the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the walls. We were gathered around the fire, trading stories and roasting marshmallows, when Mutt's ears perked up. He stood, his hackles raised, and let out a low growl. "What's up with him?" Alex asked, leaning back in his chair. I shrugged, but my stomach twisted. Mutt wasn't one to spook easily. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dense line of trees just beyond the clearing. I didn't see anything, but Mutt's growling didn't stop. "Maybe it's just a deer," Melanie said, though her voice wavered. "Or a coyote," Pete added, ever the realist. We let it go and eventually settled back into our conversation, though the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. The next day was uneventful, though the wind persisted, scattering leaves across the porch and making the trees sway like dancers in a slow, eerie waltz. We spent the morning hiking through the woods, marveling at the sheer vastness of the landscape. The air was sharp and invigorating, and for a while I felt the weight of city life melt away. Still, Mutt stayed close, his usual curiosity replaced by a nervous energy. That night, it happened. We were back around the fire, the wind roaring outside. Mutt was restless, pacing the cabin and letting out occasional whines. I was just about to take him outside when I saw it, movement at the edge of the tree line. At first, it looked like a man, standing half-concealed behind a thick pine. But something was off. The figure was too still, its silhouette too elongated. My chest tightened as the firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the clearing. I squinted, trying to make out its features, but it remained motionless, just staring. "What the hell is that?" Alex whispered, noticing where I was looking. The others turned, their faces pale as they followed my gaze. Melanie grabbed the flashlight and aimed it at the figure. The beam hit the tree, but whatever it was had moved. It didn't make a sound, yet it felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. We bolted the door and stayed close to the fire, each of us on edge. I couldn't help but think of the stories I'd heard as a kid, tales of shapeshifters and trickster spirits that haunted the woods. A camp counselor had once scared the hell out of us with a story about a creature that could mimic voices and appearances to lure people into the forest. I hadn't believed it then, but now, the night dragged on. The wind battered the cabin, and every creak of the wood set my nerves on edge. Mutt wouldn't settle, his growls growing louder and more insistent. Around midnight, we heard it. A series of guttural, almost human-like sounds circling the cabin. The thing was out there, toying with us. "Do you think it's some kind of animal?" Pete asked, his voice trembling. "No animal sounds like that," Melanie replied, clutching a knife. We stayed up all night, taking turns keeping watch. The fire burned low and the wind carried strange noises. Cracks, whispers, and that awful, inhuman chattering. I kept replaying the moment I'd seen it, that unnatural stillness and the feeling of being scrutinized. It was like it was trying to decide whether we were worth the trouble. By dawn, we couldn't take it anymore. The plan was to head for the main road a few miles away and hope for a passing car. We packed quickly, leaving the fire smoldering, and stepped into the clearing. The woods were eerily quiet. the wind gone. It felt like the calm before a storm. We moved fast, sticking together as we navigated the muddy trails. Mutt stayed close, his ears pinned back. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow darting between the trees. The thing was following us, keeping just out of sight. Then came the attack. It happened so fast. Pete was at the back of the group when something lunged at him from the underbrush. He screamed as claws tore into his shoulder, dragging him down. Alex and I rushed to pull him free while Melanie swung her flashlight at the creature. For a split second, I saw it up close. Twisted limbs, a face that was almost human but horribly wrong. Its eyes burned with a malevolent intelligence. We managed to get Pete on his feet, though he was bleeding badly. The thing didn't follow, but we could feel its presence as we stumbled toward the road. When we finally reached it, a battered pickup truck was waiting. The driver, a weathered old man, took one look at us and told us to get in without asking questions. As the truck rumbled away, I looked back at the woods. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their golden leaves catching the morning sun. It looked so peaceful, but I knew better. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. And I hoped I'd never see it again. Arnold Mortensen pulled his pickup into the cracked asphalt lot of a small, weather-beaten gas station off a lonely stretch of highway in rural Maine. The leaves had already turned, a patchwork of fiery reds and golds against the steel-gray sky. A chill hung in the air, the kind that hinted at winter's approach. Next to him, his dog Rex, a stocky mutt with mismatched eyes, perked up his ears and sniffed the air. Arnold figured Rex wasn't used to the damp, backwoodsy smells of New England. Neither was he, for that matter. Back in Boulder, the air was crisper, drier, and carried the faint scent of pine on windy days. Arnold stepped out, stretched his legs, and rubbed the back of his neck. He'd been driving for hours, heading nowhere in particular. Ever since he left Colorado, it was just him, Rex, and the open road. He figured a few days exploring Maine's wilderness would do him good. He wasn't running from anything exactly. He just needed the solitude. Working on cars day in and day out didn't leave much room for reflection, and lately he'd been thinking a lot about his parents. His dad had been a carpenter, his hands rough but steady, and his mom had an uncanny knack for remembering the details of every movie they ever watched together. Arnold guessed he got his love of films from her. The station attendant was an older man with a weathered face and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. They exchanged a few words about the weather before Arnold grabbed some supplies, jerky, water, and a bundle of firewood, and paid for gas. The attendant watched him as he loaded Rex into the truck. "You heading up to the woods?" the man asked, his tone cautious. "Yeah, figured I'd camp out a few nights," Arnold replied, throwing a grin over his shoulder. The attendant nodded slowly. "Well, stay safe. Weather's turning, and folks say these woods have stories." Arnold chuckled. "Stories, huh? Like Bigfoot?" The old man didn't laugh. "Something like that." Arnold brushed it off, though the man's words lingered in the back of his mind as he drove deeper into the wilderness. By the time he reached a clearing surrounded by towering maples and oaks, the sky had grown heavy with clouds. He set up camp, built a fire, and let Rex roam while he unpacked. The first night passed uneventfully, save for the distant hoots of owls and the occasional rustle of leaves. But on the second night, things changed. Arnold was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames and trying to decide whether the plot of The Thing held up after all these years when Rex growled low and deep. Arnold's head snapped up. Rex stood stiff, his gaze fixed on the edge of the clearing where the trees cast long, light, shifting shadows in the firelight. "Probably just a deer," Arnold muttered, though his own voice didn't sound convincing. Rex didn't relax. Instead, he took a step closer to the trees, his tail rigid. Arnold grabbed the flashlight from his pack and shined it into the darkness. The beam caught nothing but gnarled branches and fallen leaves. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. For hours, Rex refused to settle. Arnold dozed off eventually, but his sleep was fitful. The next morning, he found tracks in the mud near the edge of the clearing, huge clawed prints that looked almost human, but not quite. That evening, the unease only grew. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest seemed to come alive with noises, snapping twigs, faint whispers carried by the wind. Rex stayed close to the fire, his hackles raised. And then Arnold saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, stood behind a tree at the edge of the clearing. Its pale, almost luminescent skin stood out against the shadows, and its eyes glinted like wet stones in the firelight. It didn't move. It just stared. "Jesus," Arnold breathed, his heart pounding. He grabbed his hunting knife, more for comfort than defense. "Who's there?" he called, his voice shaky. The figure didn't answer. Slowly it shifted, slipping behind the tree and out of sight. But Arnold could feel it, circling the camp, staying just beyond the reach of the firelight. The stories the attendant mentioned came rushing back. He hadn't paid them much mind then, but now he remembered reading about something similar in a magazine years ago. The article had described creatures called Rugaru, cursed beings that stalked the woods, drawn to those who ventured too far from safety. He dismissed it as folklore, but this felt real. Arnold knew they couldn't stay. He packed what he could, keeping an eye on the shifting shadows. The creature never attacked, but its presence was suffocating, its unseen gaze a constant weight. The fire burned low as Arnold grabbed Rex's leash and prepared to leave. They moved quickly, the forest closing in around them. The creature followed, its guttural growls echoing through the trees. Arnold tripped once, tearing his jacket on a branch, but Rex barked and pulled him forward. They didn't stop until they reached the road. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, and Arnold waved frantically. The driver, a middle-aged woman in a station wagon, stopped and let them in without hesitation. She didn't ask questions, and Arnold didn't offer explanations. He was too shaken to speak, his mind replaying the image of that pale figure staring at him from the darkness. As they drove away, the forest receded into the distance, its secrets hidden once more. Arnold glanced at Rex, who had finally relaxed, his head resting on Arnold's lap. He scratched the dog's ears and whispered, "Good boy." The woman dropped them off at a nearby motel. Arnold spent the night locked in his room, the curtains drawn tight. He didn't sleep much, his thoughts returning to the old man at the gas station and the creature that had stalked them through the woods. He knew he'd never look at the wilderness the same way again. The snow crunched underfoot as I trudged through the frozen wilderness of northern Wisconsin. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a pale, golden light over the endless expanse of trees and snow. This part of the state was as remote as it got, a perfect place to get away from the world. I'd spent 2 days out here already, the silence a balm to my frayed nerves. Back in Boston, the world never seemed to stop moving. Even at night, the hum of the city found a way to seep through the cracks. But out here, it was calm. Too calm. I'd set up camp near a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The snow piled high around the fire pit, the heat from the flames melting a small circle in the icy ground. The air was crisp, and my breath plumed in the cold like smoke. I poked at the fire with a stick, watching the embers drift into the night sky. This wasn't my first winter hike, though it was my first one this deep into the wilderness. As a soldier, I'd been in tougher conditions than this. Frozen nights in the mountains, blistering days in the desert. But this was different. There was no mission, no squad to watch my back. It was just me in the woods. I figured I'd spend one more night here, then hike out in the morning. The rumors had crossed my mind more than once since I'd arrived. Stories of Bigfoot were as old as the hills, and Wisconsin had its fair share of them. Supposedly, these creatures, massive, intelligent, and elusive, roamed the forests, avoiding humans, but not always peacefully. Back home, I might have laughed it off. Out here, surrounded by endless wilderness, the idea didn't seem so far-fetched. I tossed another log onto the fire and leaned back against a tree, my mind wandering to memories of my younger brother. He'd always been the skeptic in the family, quick to dismiss anything that couldn't be proven. He used to say I spent too much time with my Warhammer miniatures, painting tiny soldiers while he went out to parties. I wondered what he'd say if I told him where I was now. A sharp crack echoed through the trees, snapping me out of my thoughts. I sat up, my hand instinctively going to the hunting knife strapped to my belt. The sound wasn't like the normal creaks and groans of the forest. It was deliberate, heavy. Something was moving out there. I stared into the darkness, the firelight casting flickering shadows across the snow. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then from the shadows I saw it, a massive shape, half hidden by the trees. It moved slowly, almost cautiously, but there was no mistaking its size. It stood at least 7 feet tall, its broad shoulders covered in matted dark fur. 2 glowing eyes stared back at me, reflecting the firelight. My pulse quickened. I'd heard the stories, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. It wasn't human, but there was intelligence in its gaze. Something calculating. I stood, knife in hand, trying to decide whether to stay or run. Before I could make up my mind, the creature let out a guttural growl, low and resonant, that sent a shiver down my spine. The fire seemed to shrink as the creature stepped closer, its massive feet crunching through the snow. I backed away, my mind racing. I'd faced danger before, but this was different. This was primal. I threw a burning log toward it, hoping to scare it off. The log landed in the snow with a hiss, but the creature didn't flinch. It bared its teeth, a row of jagged, yellow fangs, and lunged. I didn't think. I ran. The woods were a blur of white and brown as I sprinted through the trees, the creature's heavy footfalls thundering behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air burning my lungs. I stumbled once, catching myself against a tree, and glanced back. It was closer now, its massive form weaving through the trees with terrifying speed. I had no plan, no destination. I just knew I had to keep moving. The snow made every step a struggle, my boots sinking into the drifts. My legs ached, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I could hear the creature snarling behind me, its breath loud and wet. A small stream cut through the woods ahead, its surface frozen over. I skidded across it, barely keeping my balance. On the other side, the trees thinned, and I spotted a faint trail cutting through the snow. My heart leapt. This had to lead to the village I'd passed through on my way in. The creature roared, a sound so deep it seemed to shake the ground beneath me. I pushed myself harder, the trail winding through the trees like a lifeline. My legs screamed in protest, but the thought of stopping was unthinkable. Finally, the trees opened up, revealing a narrow road. I stumbled onto the asphalt, my chest heaving. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as they approached. I waved my arms, shouting for help. The car slowed, and a man rolled down his window, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Please," I gasped. "Just drive." The man didn't ask questions. I climbed into the passenger seat, my hands shaking, and we sped off. I glanced back through the rear window, half expecting to see the creature burst from the trees, but the road remained empty. The driver dropped me off at the village, where I found a small inn and locked myself in for the night. Sleep didn't come easily. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a reminder of those glowing eyes in the darkness. I left at first light, my mind replaying the encounter over and over. The creature was real. I was sure of that now. The stories weren't just stories. And as I drove away from those woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching.